perpetual virginity of Mary Sunday. That Mary is the mother of God has not been a point of difference historically between Roman Catholics and Protestants, and need not be today. And even the perpetual virginity, the concerns are much lower. I'm more agnostic about that. I just can't tell how much. It has a lot more early attestation, but I just can't tell how much that's the result of the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a 2nd century apocryphal text, and how much not. So that's kind of a tricky one, but I'll address that maybe sometime. But here I want to talk about the third Marian dogma, the Immaculate Conception. And the first thing that I want to say right out of the gate is that in allowing that Mary was not morally perfect, we are not dishonoring her. On the contrary, the biblical portrait of Mary is as a godly and courageous person, so we should speak well of her. We should seek to emulate her faith. She's one of the great heroes of Christianity. So God bless her. We're not trying to attack Mary. I have these people in the comments misunderstanding along these lines. That's not the concern. The concern is that the requirement on pain of anathema that she was kept free from all sin, including original sin, is a concern. This is so, just as with the Pius XII's Apostolic Constitution in 1950, so Pius IX's in 1854 has the same kind of warning. I'll put up on the screen here. It basically says, if anyone shall think otherwise, let him know and understand that he is condemned by his own judgment. He suffered shipwreck in the faith. He is separated from the unity of the church, etc., etc. And you can see the stakes here. Leave all legitimate room for how to best interpret anathemas. Fine, we can talk about that. I think people soften anathemas today and make them nicer than they were. But nonetheless, it's still clear, however you cash that out in terms of its application, that this is an obligatory part of Christianity. The Roman Catholic Church is making the Immaculate Conception of Mary an obligatory part of the Christian religion. Okay? So, second section, and we'll just keep it brief, go right through it. Just as quick snapshot overview. Why do we as Protestants in our conscience have a concern about this? Because the concern is basically you can't change Christianity. It's a revealed religion. If the apostles had never heard of it, you can't add it later on. And we think that that's what's going on here. We think that this wasn't something the apostles or Mary herself ever had the foggiest notion of even imagining. We think it's pretty clear that it comes in later, just as it is with the bodily assumption. I say that without a desire to provoke or give offense. It needs to be said. It's honestly, the data is pretty overwhelmingly in favor of that. Let me explain. It's a little bit different from the bodily assumption, because with the bodily assumption of Mary, you really have nothing. You don't have a hint of it anywhere early on. It's really late. But with the Immaculate Conception, you can at least make a case for it inferentially from other things. So, for example, the typology with Mary and Eve, Mary is the new Eve, or with the Ark of the Covenant, Mary is the Ark of the Covenant, or language throughout the Church Fathers of Mary as holy and pure and the model of virginity and so forth. It especially spirals up in the 4th century, but there's a lot of interest in virgins and martyrs and so forth. And then you start to see language around that time in the West, and I'm only aware of Ephraim the Syrian in the East, of Mary as without stain. So that's where you start to see this in Ambrose, for example. So you have some material you can work with. So that's better than the bodily assumption. On the other hand, the negative testimonies against the Immaculate Conception are also stronger than they are with the bodily assumption. Although I think, honestly, they're pretty overwhelming and clear with that, too. But by its very nature, the bodily assumption is less falsifiable. If you live in the time of Cyprian in 250 AD, you're not going to expect people walking around saying Mary wasn't assumed to heaven. Because it doesn't seem like anybody had any notion of that yet. You wouldn't expect counter-testimonies until something exists. But if you have people saying Mary is a sinner, and they're saying it without any expectation of pushback, and it doesn't occasion any controversy, and you get enough teachings like this, that does start to become more of a falsification of the idea. And then that is going to, in turn, inform the way you interpret these more inferential arguments from typology and so forth. Okay, so in other words, you can try to make a little better case from positive data, but then the negative data, the falsification type data, is also stronger with respect to the Immaculate Conception. And let me just go through some of those, because my observation is that when these come up, they are minimized. People don't like to hear what people like John Chrysostom are saying, and so it's kind of downplayed. It's like, oh yeah, well, some people said maybe there was once in her life when maybe she had doubt, It's like, no. We need to be clear about this. So I'll give one summary from J.N.D. Kelly, who wrote this widely respected book called The Early Christian Doctrines. And he references several important theologians from the ante-Nicene period, Irenaeus, Origen, Tertullian, etc. And he notes that in contrast to the later belief in her moral and spiritual perfection, none of these theologians had the least scruple about attributing faults to her. And then in the period between Nicaea and Ephesus, 325 to 450, so about 125 years, early 4th century to mid-5th century, he notes that way of thinking remains nearly universal in the East. Quote, almost all Eastern theologians, so far from acknowledging her spiritual and moral perfection, followed Origen in finding her guilty of human frailties. So let me give some documentation of this. Tertullian, when he's talking about the passage in Matthew 12, this is one of these passages that it comes up a lot. This is where Jesus is saying, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Matthew 12:48. There's an example in Luke 8 as well, a parallel text. And what's amazing is not just that Tertullian identifies Mary with the unbelieving Jews that rejected Christ, but that when he says something like that, he exhibits no awareness that it will be controversial or scandalous or anything like that, nor does there appear to be any pushback. Similarly, another key text is Luke 2:35 and Simeon's prophecy about the sword piercing Mary's heart. And the way Origen takes this, I'll put up on the screen here, he interprets it, and this becomes a pretty common tradition in the early church, that this is referencing being scandalized by doubt at the cross. And toward the end, he says, why do you think that the mother of the Lord was immune from scandal when the apostles were scandalized? If she did not suffer scandal at the Lord's passion, then Jesus did not die for her sins. But if all have sinned and lack God's glory, but are justified by his grace and redeemed, then Mary too was scandalized at that time. This becomes a really common view. And some people will try to argue that this, doubt at the cross didn't constitute sin, but for three reasons that is not tenable. First, Origen links Mary's being scandalized with the apostles being scandalized, the foremost example of which being Peter's 3 denials of Christ. Second, he articulates that her being scandalized is a reason why Jesus had to die for her sins, quoting Romans 3:23, that all have sinned. And third, right after this passage, like maybe a sentence or two down, I don't have it up here in front of me, but he references her being scandalized, and the sword that pierces her is the sword of infidelity. Infidelity means unfaithfulness. Now, some people try to respond to these passages in Tertullian and Origen by questioning their